So welcome to the Breakout Session D for the 2023 Connecticut Academic Library Conference. We are so glad to have you here. We would like to thank the Connecticut Council of Academic Library Directors and EBSCO hosts for supporting this year's conference. So please stick around for EBSCO's presentation at 2:30. My name is Jasmine Huff, and I will be moderating this session, Proportioning Collection Space and Learning in an Academic Library, Collection Performance Indicators. We have our presenters, Christopher Stewart, who is a Discovery and Metadata Coordinator at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock, along with our other presenter, Louise Lowe, who is the Student Success Coordinator at University of Arkansas, Little Rock. And I will turn it over to you guys and you can begin.
Thanks, Jasmine. I'm going to share my screen. And which screen do I want? So thank you very much. We're really happy to be able to make this presentation. We recently published a paper on the research of this presentation, but I feel especially good about this presentation fitting into the renew, refresh, rethink theme of this conference. What we're trying to do is rethink library space. And with that short introduction, I'm going to hand it off to Louise.
Okay, thank you, Chris. First of all, I'd like to give a little bit of background about myself and Chris in general. Both of us started working at the University of Arkansas, Little Rock. What was that? I'm sorry. About 5 years ago. And it seems like a decade ago because of so many things that have been going on in academic libraries and universities across the nation. Chris and I led a space study, which was a mixed method approach. We did surveys of students. We did observation of the way students and the patrons use the library spaces. And we also did student-led focus groups. And then, of course, today we're going to talk about collection performance indicators. One of the reasons why we chose to do a space study is because we believe, or for our campus, space seemed to be one of the most valuable commodities that the library had and that was most sought after. In addition to that, we were looking at improving how the library impacts student learning. And so it made us kind of reflect upon how do we do that? How do we demonstrate the library value? How do we demonstrate our impact on student learning and student success and student achievement? And so really it was, like Chris said, the title of this or the theme of this conference really speaks to us because the last 5 years has been a time when we had to rethink the way we had done things. My first year here, Chris's first year as well, we did what we called a strategic allocation resource report. And every unit on our campus had to do that. And basically it was justifying why you were here. And we did the typical report where we reported how many instruction sessions we had, how many books we had in the collection. We tied our value to accreditation. We were needed because we fulfill accreditation requirements. We talked about our tight budget and the increasing cost of cereals and collections. So it was pretty much the typical thing that we had done in the past. But we also realized that that wasn't going to be enough anymore, that we really needed to link ourselves to student learning. I was called to participate in, we were going up for accreditation, and I was on the committee to help with that process. And we organized a committee to work on co-curricular student learning outcomes. And I think that was one of the best experiences I've had at any university. And it allowed us to really see the value of what co-curricular units like the library can contribute to student learning. And what we did is we created learning outcomes that we would be able to use to correlate with some of the student learning outcomes of the academic side or more the curricular side. So all of that kind of led to us looking at how we collected data in a different way. And one of the things that Chris would say to us is like every touch point is an opportunity for learning, and every touch point that's an opportunity for learning is an opportunity for us to measure. And that kind of leads us really into the aspect that we're going to be talking about today, the performance indicators, collection performance indicators, because we really wanted to try to look at how was our collection really,
we don't need it. No, thank you.
how was our collection supporting student learning? And so I think that's a great lead in for you, Chris, to talk about how we looked at the collection and how we mapped that to student achievement measures. And so I'll just hand it over to you, and then we can kind of go back and forth.
Sure, thanks. So like Louise said, we started to experience a mandate coming from the campus that we needed to demonstrate that we were using our space in the best way we could. And so we had never really looked at the way the space was used. And another thing within the library is we had never done a mass weeding project. So we had a large legacy collection that had never really been evaluated in terms of its size. And all of that fit in with kind of the pre-existing view of the value within library space, where it was, is the collection coherently organized? That is, can I find the books on the shelf? And the more books that were on the shelf, what made the library better? That is, the bigger the collection size, the better. And in that model, the users of the library and the users of our library are pushed literally to the side. And what we were seeing is that there was a call for a new way of looking at the space. That is, how do we move from being a repository to a learning space? One of those things, of course, was digital, the superabundance of digital information. You know, kids learn on their phones these days. And so we also noticed that people weren't browsing our shelves. The accommodation of our printed stuff was being devalued by our users and by the campus, frankly. And what that meant was that with this new emphasis on digital information and the devalue of the physical shelves, we were being pushed toward that traditional core focus of access. How do we improve access, not just the quantity of access, but the quality of access for our learners? We found that the measures that we used to take just weren't fitting into this model. Measures like circulation counts, the number of reference questions, gate counts, in-house use. None of these were really talking to us in a way that pointed toward learning and student success. We wanted to find some metrics that would help us be within the framework of those of learning and student success. Let me see. So before I get into how we went about the study, I wanted to review some definitions, because even we found that the definitions needed to change a little bit. We needed to think differently about space. And we found that when we said collection, we were now talking about a conceptual space that included both physical and digital environments. And we decided that what that collection space was the assemblage of touch points. That is, that it's a responsive and a dynamic, it's not a static collection space. It changes with the way that the library is meeting its learners. And what we mean by library space, this is just, to get this out of the way, it's the non-staff space. It's where people can go. And so we're going to look at the entire library space. One of the things I want to mention is that we're looking at indicators. We're not looking at causal correlations in this study. And so we're going to look at 3 indicators. Demand. We're going to look for a metric that's associated with student success. And that metric that we chose were graduation rates from the different academic disciplines. We're going to look at learning activity. And the metric that we're going to use to look at learning activity is the amount of enrollment within courses. So we're going to focus on those 3 things. And where the heavy lift for this research was, we're going to map everything to 5 major disciplines: to formal sciences, natural sciences, social sciences, applied sciences, and humanities. We do that just to make the research a little bit less unwieldy and to be able to generalize our results. So the reason why I say this was a heavy lift is that we actually sat down and, like librarians, we classified things. We classified the areas of our bookshelves, we classified our databases, we classified our courses, and we classified the areas of graduations, the degrees that were being awarded within these 5 disciplines. Now, before we get into the discipline study, I want to talk about the existing shelving space, which, if we're going to talk about library space, we should talk about the biggest thing that's in that library space, which is the physical collection. On the top line, that's our library public space. That's where anyone who's not a staff member has about 20,000 square feet they can walk around in. That includes stairways, bathrooms, but this is also the floor space where study space is. Within that, about 45% of that public space is taken up by shelving. And so one of our first questions to ask was, is that shelving active? Or is it a static repository? Because we just don't see users in our shelves. And when we took a look at our average annual circulation, it turns out that only about 8% of that space that is shelving gets used. Now, that 8% is spread throughout 3 floors of shelving, but still it's a relatively small space is actually what we would call active. That is, touch points are enacted in less than 8% of the shelving space. So now I'm going to move into our indicators. The first thing we looked at was comparing the circulation to our holdings. So in these 5 discipline areas, how does the circulation compare to the holdings that we have? We're going to call circulation demand. And for this presentation, I'm going to focus on a particular comparison, and that is the theme that jumps out the most. And hopefully it's visual enough that you see where in applied sciences and humanities, there seems to be a disparity. In applied sciences, over 57% of our circulation came out of the applied sciences. And yet, only about a quarter of our physical collection is represents applied sciences. So we might say that the demand is outstripping the supply. When we look at the humanities, we see that almost half our collection is made up of humanities material, and yet only about a third of our circulation demand is for humanities material. That's the physical. When we look at we're also looking at the digital environment as part of our library space. And here we see that discrepancy in applied sciences is a little less. And what we did for this was we harvested search keywords from our EBSCO discovery service and classified them to how they fit within the 5 disciplinaries. Of course, some keywords are going to fit into more than one. We took account for that. And this was for 1 year, 2019, notably before COVID. What we saw was that 54% of the search keywords being entered in our databases were for applied sciences subject, but only about 42% of our databases actually could be applied to applied sciences. Whereas in the humanities, over 60% of our databases are in humanities areas, but our users are only putting in about 7% of all our search terms are humanities questions. So we see this discrepancy, and there's different conclusions we can draw from this. Again, we're not talking about causal relationships, we're just talking about indicators. The learning activity that we identified was enrollments, that is the number of students within courses. So almost half of our enrollments are in the applied sciences. That's at 47%. And yet in our holdings, again, we only have about a quarter of our collection is within the area of applied sciences. So we can say that in the learning activity within applied sciences outstrips the way we're supporting that in the library. Whereas if we look at the humanities, almost half our collection is associated with humanities subjects, but only about 18% of course enrollments are within humanities. So again, there's an indication that we might be undersupplying the applied sciences and oversupplying the humanities. When we look at the digital environment for learning activity, we see a little bit better balance within the applied sciences. But in the humanities, there's that discrepancy again, where the humanities account for over 60% of our database subscriptions, but we only have about 18% of our whole enrollments are in humanities. So again, there's an indication that we might be oversupplying the humanities. We can look over at social sciences. We see a bit another outstanding discrepancy. We might be oversupplying in social sciences. So that's enrollments. The next thing we're going to look at is graduation within these areas, within these discipline areas. And we see this same pattern of discrepancy between the applied sciences and the humanities. Over 65% of our graduates come out of applied sciences, and they're supported by only a quarter of our library physical holdings of our library collection. And again, looking at humanities, almost half of our collection is within the humanities areas, and that's supporting only 11% of graduates. So again, there's an indication that we're undersupplying applied sciences, oversupplying humanities. And just to mention it, I'm just focusing on those two areas because they demonstrate what we're trying to say about collection performance indicators. When we look at graduations, and by the way, these database subscriptions are coming from our A to Z list, and we classify those as they fall within the 5 discipline areas. Like I mentioned before, some of the databases will fall into more than one discipline. And so we did take that into account. We see that same discrepancy showing up with graduations and database subscriptions. We're undersupplying in applied sciences and very much so oversupplying in humanities. And in the research paper that Louise and I published, we do talk about these findings in more detail. I don't want to give the impression that what we found in formal sciences, natural sciences, and social sciences doesn't matter. It does matter, and definitely within the practice of using this research, we would look at those really closely as more than I'm doing for the sake of time in this presentation. So what good does this do for us? And like I've been trying to say is that these are indicators, they're not specific causal. We're not saying that because we have this many databases, we have this many graduates within that area. What we're trying to do is find a metric that can put our library measures and the way that we talk about the library and the way that we talk about what happens within the space of the library within the framework of the learning demands at the university. Those learning demands have to do with learning activity and student success. And so we tried to find what is the indication that our collection has an association with those two learning demands. One of the things that this type of evaluation does, this type of comparison, is it gives a bird's eye view of the entire collection by looking at demand and learning activity and a metric of student success within graduations. We now have a data-driven rationale to balance and to resize. We're not, and one of the things that I'll point out is that we're talking about proportions within, we're not talking about the numbers, we're talking about proportions. So does the proportions of applied sciences resources meet the proportions of applied sciences demand that's coming from the campus. There's some future considerations within this. And one is, it becomes really obvious to me that we over aggregated the applied sciences. What is an applied science? Well, it covers everything, if I'm not mistaken, from nursing to construction management. And so if we've over clustered in applied sciences, and we would need to disaggregate that so that we could have more significant findings in more discrete fields of study. Now, the other thing is that there's a lot of considerations that go into collection development. And we're not deaf or blind to those considerations, especially like when I think about our humanities collection. It was, we can say, lovingly built over decades of work with a lot of dedication from librarians. We carefully built this, the whole collection. We just have never weeded this collection. And one of the things we would have to do in a mass weeding project is we need to identify what are the core titles. You know, one of the things that we're moving toward is a just-in-time model where we use DDA. I need this, I can get it just in time by getting a DDA title, a demand-driven access. But there's still a place for just-in-case access. That is, we're not throwing the repository out with the bathwater. There still is a need for core collections to be preserved and maintained within collection development. So that's definitely something that we would need to take into account into the future. And those are my comments. I see that people have asked in the chat, but before we do that, Louise, did you want to, do you have any comments you want to add, or do you want to talk about how as what used to be called a reference librarian, the way you think of space has changed?
Yeah, when you were talking, there were a couple of things that I wanted to kind of emphasize. I know I've been a librarian for a very long time, and I know that collections are a very sensitive topic. And but I think it's worth mentioning that this is one measure or one approach, one method. And we need to get into the habit of having multiple so that we have the ability to have a balanced view of things. So we wouldn't necessarily think that this was the only way to look at it, but it is one way to look at it. And what it also did for me, it forces us to look at data and facts and move more away from, and I'm not discounting our natural abilities and how we feel about our collections, but I think where Chris and I agree is that when we're reporting about the value of the library, the feel-good nature is not going to be enough anymore. So we're going to have more data and more measures that actually support the claims that we're making. It's not going to be enough to just say we're the library and we need to exist and these things have to be here. We need to have some evidence to support that. And what this did was, I already knew that most libraries circulate about 10% of their collections, but we've always maintained the collection and the number and the size. But as more campus partners seek more space, how we did this to prove that we didn't know how this would turn out. And it just happened to turn out this way. So I would say that one of the things we might want to do is do a focus group or some type of follow-up of this evidence to kind of narrow down. And I think what Chris said, look at the clusters that we did. So there's still work to be done in this area. But what it does, it sets us up to have an opportunity to demonstrate our value, but also evaluate the things that we prioritize. The other thing in terms of just, I would say libraries in general, the just in case, just in time. We no longer have a reference desk because it was mostly just in case. And so now it's a just in time. We try to incorporate our services wherever the students are. Maybe that looks like it's in Blackboard and they can access information about libraries or chat with a librarian when they're actually working on the assignment. Other things that we do, we train peer mentors that are already existing on campus and they already have relationships with students. So this whole concept of they don't have to come to us anymore. We are trying to meet them wherever they are. So that I wanted to emphasize the fact that our library as a whole is moving from the just in case to just in time. But that again, it doesn't mean that we're abandoning the traditions that we love and hold. I think those were the three things that you can't just have one measure and say this is how we're going to decide on this. And this is one of many that we would put together to make some informed decisions. And I think when reporting out to the campus, it's going to have to be data informed, and it's also going to have to connect to student learning. There's one of the things that we learned from our strategic allocation report is the feedback we got is that every unit on this campus needs to demonstrate how they impact student learning and student learning outcomes. And for a long time, that usually has meant the instruction and reference maybe. But I think for our library, we're looking at every touch point is an opportunity for student learning. And what Chris has really done in the work that the analysis that he's done is associate that with collections. And we've done that in other areas as well. So every student worker who works there works at the library. We are looking at ways to measure student learning, even if there are student workers in the library. So every opportunity, we're trying to maximize the opportunity to demonstrate the value of libraries. So I don't want to get it too far off into another topic. We're really talking about collections. So I want to have a chance for everyone to ask their questions. Chris, is that the link to the free copies? Because I think we can give out free copies or we have 50 free copies we can give out. And I'd love to give that to our audience so they can, I'll find it and link it out. But I know that there were some questions and I want to give people enough time to ask their questions.